My name's David Lehmann. I'm Emeritus from Cambridge University, where I've taught for 40 years. I've done research in Latin America, in Israel, on Catholics, on evangelicals, Pentecostals, on Jews, especially on Messianic Jews, which may come up. Well, it's changed with modern globalization because, of course, the one feature of religion is that it has been migrating across the world and across geographical, cultural, and political frontiers forever. Because an idea can migrate without much control, or it's very difficult to control. The difference in the modern period, in the contemporary period of globalization, is that it goes to and fro so easily because, of course, of migration and communication. So, whereas in previous periods, people who migrated with an idea would have been under a lot of pressure to adapt to new circumstances, much as they might have tried not to, or might have tried to protect themselves against those circumstances. In the modern period, what we notice is that people are able to take a way of life, or a chunk of the way of life, with them. And then they also can continue to interact with and influence the way in which religion or other cultural habits takes place in their places of origin. Of course, they may have several places of origin if they move around a lot. So you have this reflexive character in which, for example, people in London who come from Pakistan may come from villages in Pakistan, or they may come from small towns in Bangladesh. They are acquiring habits in London which may have influence in Pakistan or Bangladesh. And also, of course, they are doing something which is relatively new, which is they are bringing their husbands and wives from Pakistan and Bangladesh. So there's this reflexive character, which means that you have much more of a mosaic than you might otherwise. When you talk about boundaries and how that shapes identity, then you're not just talking about physical boundaries, of course. There are 101 boundaries which anthropologists talk about. There are linguistic boundaries, there are ways of dress which create a quasi-symbolic boundary around you and your network or your community. There are territorial boundaries if people tend to congregate and to live in particular neighborhoods. And so in a freer society, or a more secularized society, that's to say a society in which the state is not regulating how people talk and how they dress and where they live, then these can be deployed and indeed reinforced. So it may even become easier in a more secularized society for communities to set themselves apart if they want to, and if there's that pressure to do so. And so you also get these sort of trans-boundary boundaries in which people are dressing or talking the same across very large distances. So if you look at ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York, Los Angeles, Jerusalem, London, they all seem to be the same. They all talk the same language, and they indeed marry among themselves. They have marriage arrangements among themselves across these distances. And they are able to do this in a way because you have a secularized system. By secularized, of course, I mean a system where the state does not regulate, or only very lightly regulates, religion. I know that varies and is sometimes controversial. So I don't mean that no one believes in religion anymore. That's another story. But we have some very curious and counterintuitive examples. So how is it that Pentecostals and evangelicals seem to be able to carry particular ways of praying, preaching, particular norms of propriety, of prudishness, if you wish, of Puritanism, across enormous boundaries, and often also creating enclaves in societies which are utterly different from anything where the Pentecostals and evangelicals have been before. In the New Guinea Highlands, for example, there's a fascinating book about a tiny group of people of some 300 in a godforsaken part of the highlands of New Guinea, which is a country which has like 300 languages. And it's called Learning to be Sinners. So somehow these people created a little evangelical enclave, and just because of one person who had a contact with the outside world. And they started to have confession systems. Of course, then it began also to adapt to their own systems. And there are some quite funny stories in the book that I'm referring to, which is by someone called Jerry Robbins, who is a professor in Cambridge now. And he describes how they throw away the ancestors, or rather they throw away the bones of the ancestors, because the bones of the ancestors have been central to their life. They are told that this is paganism and this is wrong, and they throw away the bones of the ancestors which they had in their houses because they were protecting them from evil spirits. And then someone asked them, the anthropologist asked them, well, what do you think? Do you think you'll ever go back to your ancestors? And they say, no. And anyhow, the way we've treated them, they wouldn't have us back anyhow. So yeah, there are these adaptations, but what's striking overall is how in the middle of, so to speak, nowhere, you can have this little enclave. And the Pentecostals are particularly good at that. They do it in the Brazilian Amazon and so on. I mean, some anthropologists get very cross about this because they say it's a war against the local culture, which indeed it is. But of course, there are also these syncretisms with the local culture. And so the boundaries are formed in 101 different ways. I mean, usually one notices them in big cities in Western Europe in particular, or in New York. But it happens all over the place. Of course, there are places in the world where these things are not possible because the state really does control religion, but maybe like Saudi Arabia. But there aren't that many of them actually. If you unpack a religious package, so to speak, if you unpack a set of religious norms, and of course every, so to speak, religion is a set of religious traditions which come together and can permutated and combined in different ways, then you see that there are ways of praying, there are articles of belief, there are ways of dressing, all sorts of habits of daily life, which can be unpacked, and then some of those can find a hook or a way of an attraction, an elective affinity in a particular local circumstance. I think there's been, as you know, there's been a massive growth in evangelical Christianity in Latin America, and although it's been going now for almost 100 years, it acquired a very high profile from about the 1980s. Why did it acquire a high profile? Because suddenly the sociologists and anthropologists and maybe journalists, they looked around and said, oh my God, what the hell's going on? Oh dear, these are the wrong metaphors, but they get the point across. A society, a culture which was widely accepted as Catholic, even by people who were not believers, was being undermined from below. It wasn't sponsored by great powers. People blamed the Americans and so on. That was, even the people who didn't, that was very quickly understood to be nonsense because it was such a massive movement. By now, in Brazil, for example, 20%, it is said, of the population are evangelicals. Well, this is 40 million people. This is a serious business. And this is not going to happen by some manipulation from outside. So what was it about Pentecostalism or evangelical Christianity which found a hook, which found a point of engagement with Brazilian popular culture, with the concerns of the Brazilian masses? Because it went in very much, if not to the absolutely poorest, to the lower middle and the lower classes, the low income groups. And I think one thing was that it offered to women a place to go. these are social strata where the family has been under enormous disintegrative pressures for quite some time now, and the male role has disintegrated really. And so women are running their families on their own, and they are under enormous pressure from their partners, their erstwhile partners, their future partners, their fathers, their brothers, their sons, and so on. The church is somewhere where they could go and be a person, just that. It didn't matter what you did. You could just be sweeping the floor, but you were like a citizen in the church. You were respected. You had a job. You had a role, and you were respected for that role. And if you gave money of the little you had, you also felt and feel a pride in that. So people, outsiders, complain, and sometimes, I must say, with reason, but not always. And even if it is with reason, it's not necessarily important. Outsiders complain that the churches, some of them especially, are putting enormous pressure on people to give of the little they have to the church. But although there is that pressure, especially in certain sorts of churches, the other side of the coin is that people don't necessarily want to be in the position of being dependent and of receiving alms, they don't want to be beggars, they want to be persons. And one way of being a person is to make a contribution. So for women in particular, who are the majority of Pentecostals, this is, I think, terribly important. So the pastors found a way in. They may not have calculated it like that, but they found this receptive audience. And of course also the pastors themselves, the preachers at the local levels, they're like small entrepreneurs. If you can't make money as as a welder or as a bus driver, or you don't want to do it, maybe you can make a living as a pastor. It may sound cynical, but everyone has to live. And so they too, and one striking feature of the permeation of borders is that the style of preaching that you hear in a Latin American low-income neighborhood is very similar to what you would hear in London or elsewhere. This is caught on very easily, and there, of course, I suppose, international media have helped. Though on the whole, I don't think the media are a very big feature of all this. So that's one way in which they can permeate boundaries. The other interesting and difficult way evokes what I was saying about New Guinea, which is that evangelical and Pentecostal preachers inveigh against demons and advertise the conversion to a faith in Jesus as a way of protecting oneself against the devil. Well, of course, among Brazilians, so-called Afro-Brazilian religions, which by now, centuries later, are really Brazilian religions, are full of fear of curses, fear of spells, fear and worries about the entities which may control your life. And if you go to Africa, especially all parts of Africa really, this is even much more powerful actually than in Brazil. And so they, in a curious way, although they preach against these forces, in a way they're believing in the efficacy of those forces and offering a way of countering them and a refuge away from them as well. One example is how if people migrate to the cities, this is now West African, but in West Africa, people who migrate to cities find themselves under siege really from their relatives who are still in the villages to do them favors, to receive their children so the children can go to school, and to take them into their houses essentially. But of course these people are now trying to make it. They're just becoming socially mobile. They are rising up in the social scale a bit. They've got an education. That's why they went to the city. And so this is too much pressure for them. If they refuse these pressures, they could well have evil spells put upon them. So if you go to the Pentecostal church, that will protect you against these spells. And this is, there are accounts also in South Africa, everywhere really, of how this mechanism works. So you have a hook, you can plug into the local culture, even in the most counterintuitive way. Of course, the Catholic Church and the Anglican churches, which were brought to these places, if you like, by colonialism from above and so on, they also offer refuge, and they offer protection, and they offer various things, but what they don't offer is a possibility of people of the laity becoming preachers, becoming important people. I mean, they do have a strong division between the people who have gone through long training and been to seminaries and so on, and the laity. So there's not that element of community, and that element of provision of a career doesn't really work. You might think that Judaism is a package, but of course it is. But it's many different packages. But like other religions, bits and pieces of it can, if not broken off, can find their own careers. And what we now know, and has been known in the sort of collective imagination in certain parts of the world for quite a long time, is that when the Jews were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain and Portugal, especially from Portugal, they then went off around the world following the Portuguese discoveries and the trade routes. So they went to Asia, they went around Africa, they followed the colonial regime to Brazil, and in fact, also from Portugal, they went to the Spanish-speaking countries like Mexico and so on. And there they were known as Portuguese, but actually everyone knew that the people who were called Portuguese were actually Jews. They, of course, had been forced to convert, so they hid their Jewishness. But in different degrees, they preserved Jewish practices. These are the people who later become known as the Sephardi Jews, because Sepharad in Hebrew means Spanish. Others went to the Ottoman Empire, where they were received as Jews, and they could be Jews, and of course they had a flowering career for centuries there. But in the Spanish and Portuguese, especially in Brazil, colonies, the Spanish-Portuguese colonies, they were cut off really from the mainstream, any of the mainstreams of Jewish celebration, so they couldn't have synagogues and things like this, except briefly when the Dutch took over part of northern Brazil in the 17th century. And then when the Dutch were thrown out, they went to, this community went to New York and founded New York, and that's why in New York there's Peter Stuyvesant. You see, a Dutchman found New York. He came from Brazil. And they went to the Caribbean and so on. Now, what's interesting to us is how these bits and pieces of Jewish habits and Jewish practices then were preserved through generations in a kind of very narrow genealogy. And so that one finds, and one hears, and I've heard this in Brazil, and now there's more anthropological evidence about this. People say, oh yes, well my mother used to, or my grandmother used to light the candles on Friday. Or they would say, we were always circumcised in my family. Or they would say, well, we always married among each other, whatever each other might mean. Or my father never went to church, and so on. And now, of course, it's become terribly fashionable to be Jewish in Brazil, where the recognized Jewish population are extremely high, are a very wealthy, small but very wealthy and quite widely recognized and indeed admired group. It's quite fashionable to be Jewish. So these things are kind of coming up to the surface. So now, in my research in Brazil, I have discovered a small but growing proliferation of congregations. So we don't call them churches, we don't call them synagogues, and they seem to be largely populated by people who have been evangelicals and now decide that they are really Jews, and so they adopt bits and pieces of Jewish ritual. They meet on the Sabbath, they have some songs in Hebrew, they mix their prayers with the Hebrew word for Jesus, which is Yeshua, and they are very millenarian, because they believe that the Messiah will return, and all the peoples will then go and look up to the Lord of the whole world in Jerusalem. So they've mixed in a veneration for a Jewish tradition with the veneration of Jesus, and they and then there are all sorts of variations. So you also have Jews who have become believers, as they call themselves, in Jesus. And there's a lot of that, especially in the United States and in Israel, and so they are sort of shifting. They are mixing in their Jewishness with their belief in Jesus. So they tend to have more Christian sorts of services, and they call the New Testament the New Covenant, shall we say. And then you have other people who seem to be more Pentecostal, who are taking their Jewishness more seriously, like they wear prayer shawls, and they have some elements in Hebrew and so on. So there's all these different variations, and what people are doing is they are taking now in a new way, because they are visible, they are taking bits and pieces and putting together the beginnings of what might eventually become quite some sort of movement. For the moment, it's very varied, but it's certainly catching on, yes. So one dimension of globalization is that people develop people, i.e. intellectuals mostly, or leaders of one sort or another, develop an idea about others. No, they develop a theory about others, and then they act upon that theory. The Catholic Church has been doing this for a very long time. When they accompanied the Spaniards at first, in particular, to the Americas, they had to work out, well, who were these people with whom they engaged? Were they human beings? Did they have souls? And they developed a theory about why it was that these people were undertaking human sacrifice. And one theory was that was their way of worshipping God, not their God, but of worshipping God. That somehow, being human, they had a natural inclination to worship God. It just so happened they did it in this way. And Catholicism has continued really to try and work out how to engage with others. So you have local adaptations of Catholicism everywhere in Europe as well. You know, all these local fiestas, every village in Spain, in Italy, in France has had in the past its own annual celebrations, its own virgin and so on, its own saint, its own patron saint, its own celebrations with local variations. And that may not be so common nowadays in Europe, though it's still quite common. And it continued on a large scale in Latin America, where you had massive cults, for example, of the Mexican patron saint, now decreed the Empress of the Americas, the Virgin of Guadalupe. The story is that in Mexico, after 100 years after the Mexican Revolution, people only believe in two things, which is the lottery and the Virgin of Guadalupe. But the crucial point is that some religious movements and some people who are carrying religion across the world, or carrying particular traditions across the world, try to understand the other, try to engage with the other, and incorporate the other's ideas and culture into what they're doing. You know? Others just go for it, so to speak. They confront the other, like I described for evangelicals, frontally. But even then, as I said, with respect to the ideas about evil and the devil, they are going to adapt locally. So you have the kind of reflexivity of globalization, which is influencing the way in which religion is carried across the world and is adapted in different local circumstances. So this of course then affects the aspiration of religions to be universal. And one of the interesting things is that some of the most apparently culturally bound religious traditions, of course all of them are, we Europeans think that we are universal because we're Europeans, but we're not Europeans. One of the most culturally bound, or apparently culturally bound religious traditions, namely Hinduism or the Hinduisms. Hinduism itself is apparently an invention of outsiders. There were lots and lots of gods and so on, and the British and maybe others also came and they said, that's Hinduism, like we have Christianity, they have an ism, everyone has to have their ism. But it's how that has spread to tremendous effect throughout Europe and the United States and beyond. In Israel also, Buddhism is a very prominent, a very widespread, not necessarily prominent, but a very widespread practice. You can easily be Jewish and Buddhist at the same time. There's no real issue. But what's interesting is how Hinduism has, so I shouldn't say the word Hinduism, how Hindu practices and Hindu ideas have been brought by Hindu preachers and prophets and missionaries and just entrepreneurs and gurus and all these people to the West, and then of course have taken Westerners back to South Asia, to ashrams and so on, and it has been reformulated in a Western context. So, for example, yoga becomes a way of keeping fit. So, and also how they have taken on Western ideas about therapy, about meditating, looking into yourself, and they have really detached themselves. So again, you have bits and pieces which have detached themselves. There's nothing wrong with this; it's happening all the time. But they advertise themselves initially as something exotic or different, and then they catch on or they hook into the local practices or to Western practices. So they also may hook into ethnic attractions, though actually they don't seem to be this sort of self-improving Oriental religion doesn't seem to be particularly popular among Orientals themselves, unless they are the entrepreneurs. But the Kabbalah centers, which were made famous by Madonna, have found that they have been oscillating. Are they trying to be attractive to Jews, or are they trying to offer themselves as something which is not particularly Jewish to non-Jews? So sometimes they go for the ethnic side, and sometimes they go for the more essentially self-improvement, curative sort of therapeutic side. So this is very cosmopolitan because they are engaging with a different culture, and they've become a Western style of, if you want to call it religion or therapy or self-improvement. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, the self-improvement is a vast industry worldwide. You go into bookshops and so on. And Pentecostal churches also are into it. I mean, some of the neo-Pentecostal churches publish endless books, how to keep your husband, big issue, how to keep your husband, big issue. And how to have a good marriage, all this sort of thing. So they also are getting into the sort of therapy and so on. And some fringes of Judaism, of ultra-Orthodox Judaism, are also going into these therapeutic cultures as well. So it's I don't know how this fits into globalization specifically, but it's more like a secularization of religion, really. So what, in the modern world, very, very broadly, especially in Europe and in the Americas, the state has pulled back from most regulation of religion. But we still do have countries where one particular religious tradition is dominant, not officially. I mean, like in France. France is a country with a Catholic heritage. In Britain is still a country with a Christian heritage. The Church and what's interesting about those sorts of situations, where you do have a hegemonic set of institutions, a hegemonic religious culture, maybe that's the crucial point, hegemonic religious culture, that you have some sort of religious institution which is open to everybody. So they have very weak frontiers. in Britain, anyone can get married in the Anglican Church. That's the law, and except if you're gay. So, I mean, you can if you're gay, but you'd have to marry a person of the opposite sex. So you can't have a gay marriage in church. But you, and in France, Catholicism is part of the national heritage, and they have a word for people who are not believers but still revere or have a high regard for their heritage. They're called catholiques. So they're laïc. They're not Catholic. They're catholique. And so there is this sort of this institution which is available to the whole society. So people, it can be available to make peace in Northern Ireland or help making peace, or as a place to also where people can seek solace and so on. Whereas in the United States, where there's never been such a national religious institution which is for everybody, religion, which is so deeply rooted in the culture, especially in this kind of rural history of the United States, has been and increasingly is a force for division and is used for political ends. Now, this is not always a bad thing, because the civil rights movement relied a lot on pastors and on an image of the promised land and the Exodus and that sort of heroism, and Martin Luther King himself, of course. And now it seems to be a different story in which religion is being used to bring politicians into people's bedrooms and to further these cultural wars which are so strong in the United States, and not only in the United States, because they're beginning also to appear in Europe as well. So this is this lack of regulation of religion, total lack of regulation of religion, which is in a sense part of an international human rights claim, also has its dangers, shall we say. Yeah.